when three popular girls cornered the quiet new student in the school bathroom and decided to teach her a lesson with a vicious slap across the face. They had no idea they were about to meet someone who had survived Taliban ambushes in Afghanistan and earned 2 Purple Hearts before her 21st birthday. What happened next would become the most talked about incident in Lincoln High's history, turning 3 bullies into cautious observers and transforming an underestimated veteran into an unlikely hero. Alexandra. Alex Chen stood barely 5 feet, 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail and dark, brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. At 19, she looked younger than most of the seniors at Lincoln High School in Riverside, California, where she had enrolled 3 weeks ago after completing her medical discharge from the Army. Her slight frame, weighing no more than 125 pounds, was hidden beneath oversized hoodies and loose-fitting jeans that made her appear even smaller than she actually was. The thick-rimmed glasses she wore were a recent addition, prescribed after an IED explosion near Kandahar had left her with minor vision issues and persistent headaches. Combined with her naturally reserved demeanor and the way she seemed to shrink into herself when walking through the crowded hallways, Alex presented the perfect image of an easy target. She carried herself with a subtle hunch to her shoulders, as if trying to make herself invisible, and rarely made eye contact with other students. What her new classmates at Lincoln High couldn't see were the scars hidden beneath her long sleeves. Thin white lines across her forearms from shrapnel, a puckered circular mark on her left shoulder from a sniper's bullet that had nearly ended her military career, and the psychological wounds that ran much deeper. They couldn't see the way her eyes automatically scanned every room for exits, or how she instinctively positioned herself with her back to walls whenever possible. They had no way of knowing that this quiet girl who jumped slightly at loud noises had spent 18 months as a combat medic in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire while coordinating helicopter evacuations. Alex had enlisted in the Army at 17 with her parents' reluctant consent, driven by a desire to serve her country and earn money for college. Her petite stature had initially caused some doubt among her drill sergeants, but she had proven herself through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. During basic training, she had excelled in hand-to-hand combat, despite being the smallest recruit in her unit, compensating for her size with speed, precision, and an intuitive understanding of leverage and anatomy. Her deployment to Afghanistan had been supposed to last 12 months, but she had extended her tour twice, feeling a deep sense of responsibility to her unit and the soldiers she treated. She had saved dozens of lives during her time overseas, working tirelessly in field hospitals and forward operating bases, where medical supplies were scarce and enemy attacks were frequent. Her commanding officers had praised her coolness under fire and her ability to make life-or-death decisions in split seconds. The incident that ended her military career had occurred during her final month of deployment. Her convoy had been returning from a humanitarian mission in a remote village when they were ambushed by Taliban fighters. Alex had been riding in the lead vehicle when an improvised explosive device detonated directly beneath them, killing the driver instantly and leaving Alex with a concussion, multiple lacerations, and severe psychological trauma. She had spent the next 40 minutes treating wounded soldiers while under heavy enemy fire, refusing evacuation until every other injured person had been airlifted to safety. The Army had offered her a medical discharge with full honors, recognizing both her physical injuries and the post-traumatic stress that had developed in the aftermath of the attack. Alex had accepted reluctantly, knowing that her military career was over, but uncertain about what came next. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than she had anticipated, filled with sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, and a persistent feeling that she no longer belonged anywhere. Her parents, Both professors at UC Riverside had welcomed her home with open arms, but struggled to understand what their daughter had experienced overseas. They encouraged her to finish high school and pursue the college education that her military service had made possible. But Alex found it nearly impossible to relate to teenagers who worried about prom dates and college applications when she had spent months watching young soldiers die in her arms. Lincoln High School represented a chance for normalcy that Alex desperately wanted, but wasn't sure she could achieve. The building itself was typical of Southern California high schools, sprawling single-story structures, connected by covered walkways, palm trees scattered throughout the campus, and the ever-present smell of cafeteria food mixed with the faint scent of eucalyptus from nearby trees. The student body was diverse, reflecting the multicultural makeup of Riverside, with groups of friends clustering around outdoor lunch tables and gathering in the quad between classes. Alex navigated this environment like a ghost, arriving early to avoid the morning crowds and leaving immediately after her last class. She had chosen her schedule carefully, opting for advanced courses that would challenge her academically while avoiding electives that might require group interaction or presentations. Her teachers had noted her exceptional work, but also her reluctance to participate in class discussions, interpreting her silence as shyness rather than the hypervigilance that came from months of survival training. The other students had initially tried to include her in conversations and social activities, but Alex's polite deflections and obvious discomfort in group settings had eventually led them to leave her alone. She preferred it that way, or at least told herself she did. The constant chatter about weekend parties and relationship drama felt trivial compared to the experiences that had shaped her recent past, and she found it easier to maintain her emotional distance than to risk forming connections that might be disrupted by her ongoing struggles with PTSD. Her daily routine was carefully structured to minimize stress and avoid situations that might trigger anxiety attacks. She arrived at school exactly 15 minutes before first period, ate lunch alone in the library while catching up on homework, and spent her free periods in the guidance counselor's office, completing college application materials she had memorized. The layout of the campus within her first week, identifying multiple exit routes from every building and noting the locations of security cameras and administrative offices. Alex's medical discharge papers were tucked away in her backpack along with her student ID and class schedule. But she had no intention of sharing her military background with anyone at Lincoln High. The few times classmates had asked about her previous school or where she had lived before moving to Riverside, she had given vague answers about traveling with her family and being homeschooled. She had learned that mentioning military service, especially combat deployment, tended to make people uncomfortable and led to questions she wasn't ready to answer. The nightmares that still plagued her sleep made it difficult to concentrate during early morning classes, and she often found herself struggling to stay awake despite the medication prescribed by her VA therapist. Her grades remained excellent through sheer force of will and years of military discipline, but the effort required to maintain her academic performance while managing her psychological symptoms left her exhausted by the end of each school day. What Alex wanted most was to blend into the background, complete her remaining high school requirements, and move on to college where she could start fresh without the weight of her military experience defining every interaction. She had no interest in making friends, joining clubs, or participating in the social activities that seemed to consume her classmates' lives. All she wanted was to be left alone to heal, to find some measure of peace in the structured routine of academic achievement, and to prove to herself that she could succeed in the civilian world despite the psychological scars that threatened to overwhelm her at unexpected moments. Lincoln High School buzzed with the typical energy of a Thursday morning in late September, students streaming through the main entrance in clusters of friends, their conversations mixing with the sound of locker doors slamming and sneakers squeaking against polished linoleum floors. The campus stretched across 15 acres of prime riverside real estate. Its modern architecture, featuring glass-walled classrooms and open-air corridors designed to take advantage of Southern California's year-round sunshine. Palm trees dotted the quad area where students gathered before first period, their fronds rustling in the warm breeze that carried the scent of jasmine from the landscaped gardens surrounding the administrative building. Alex arrived precisely at 7:45, the same time she had arrived every day for the past 3 weeks. She parked her father's old Honda Civic in the back corner of the student lot, choosing a spot that offered easy access to the street, while remaining far enough from the main flow of student traffic to avoid unwanted attention. Her backpack, a standard black JanSport that looked identical to dozens of others on campus, contained her textbooks, notebooks, and a carefully organized collection of pens, pencils, and highlighters arranged in a military precise manner that would have made her former drill sergeant proud. The morning routine that Alex had developed served multiple purposes beyond simple organization. By arriving early, she could enter the building while the hallways were still relatively empty, avoiding the sensory overload that came with hundreds of teenagers talking, laughing, and moving in seemingly random directions. She could reach her locker, gather her materials for the first period, and settle into her seat in a P chemistry before the room filled with other students whose casual conversations about weekend plans and relationship drama felt like noise from another world. Her first period teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had noticed Alex's punctuality and academic focus, but had stopped trying to draw her into class discussions after several polite but minimal responses. The chemistry concepts came easily to Alex, perhaps because her medical training had required extensive knowledge of human physiology and pharmacology, but she preferred to demonstrate her understanding through written assignments rather than verbal participation. She sat in the back corner of the classroom, positioned so she could see both the door and the windows while keeping her back protected, a habit she had developed during her deployment that now felt as natural as breathing. Transition between classes presented the greatest challenge in Alex's carefully constructed daily routine. Lincoln High's corridors transformed into rivers of teenage energy during the 5-minute passing periods, with students rushing to their next classes while shouting to friends, comparing homework answers, and engaging in the complex social negotiations that seemed to consume so much of their mental energy. Alex had learned to time her movements to avoid the worst of the crowds, waiting until the initial rush had passed before making her way to her next classroom with quick, efficient steps that betrayed her military training to anyone who knew what to look for. Her second period American history class occupied a corner room in the newer wing of the school, with large windows that looked out over the football field where the maintenance crew was already preparing for Friday night's homecoming game. The teacher, Mr. Patterson, was a former college football player whose enthusiasm for his subject matter was infectious, but Alex found herself struggling to connect with discussions about historical events that felt distant compared to the modern conflicts she had witnessed firsthand. When the class studied the Vietnam War, she had to excuse herself to visit the nurse's office, overwhelmed by memories of treating soldiers whose injuries bore striking similarities to those described in their textbook. The campus layout at Lincoln High reflected the educational philosophy of the early 2000s, when the school had been built with the intention of creating a more open, collaborative learning environment. Classrooms opened directly onto outdoor walkways, encouraging interaction between students and teachers while providing natural light and ventilation. The central quad served as the heart of campus life, with circular concrete platters that doubled as seating areas and a raised platform that hosted morning announcements and occasional student performances. Alex had memorized every detail of this layout within her first week, not out of academic interest but from the survival instincts that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. She knew which doors provided the quickest exit from each building, where the security cameras were positioned, and which areas offered the best sight lines in all directions. This information was filed away in her mind alongside more mundane details like class schedules and assignment due dates, all part of the constant threat assessment that her brain performed automatically. The student body at Lincoln High was remarkably diverse, reflecting the changing demographics of Riverside County. The school served families from a wide range of economic backgrounds, from the wealthy neighborhoods in the hills overlooking the city to the working-class communities near the industrial areas along the freeway. This diversity was evident in the cafeteria, where students self-segregated into groups that often reflected cultural or economic boundaries, though there was more mixing than might be found in schools with less varied populations, Alex observed. These social dynamics with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The hierarchies and alliances that seemed so important to her classmates reminded her of the tribal politics she had witnessed in Afghan villages, though the stakes here were obviously much lower. She could identify the alpha personalities who commanded attention and respect, the followers who sought acceptance through association, and the outcasts who existed on the margins of social acceptance. What she couldn't understand was why any of it mattered when there were so many more pressing concerns in the world. Her third period, Advanced Placement English class, was taught by Ms. Kim, a young teacher who had graduated from UCLA just 2 years earlier and still possessed the idealistic enthusiasm of someone who believed literature could change lives. The classroom walls were covered with inspirational quotes from famous authors and posters promoting banned books, creating an atmosphere that encouraged intellectual risk-taking and creative expression. Alex appreciated the teacher's passion, but found herself unable to engage with assignments that required personal reflection or emotional vulnerability. When the class discussed themes of war and sacrifice in works like The Things They Carried and Slaughterhouse-Five, Alex's written responses demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the material that impressed her teacher, but she consistently deflected attempts to explore her own perspectives on these topics. Her essays were technically excellent, demonstrating advanced analytical skills and a mature writing style, but they maintained a clinical distance that suggested deep personal experience carefully held at arm's length. The physical education requirement had posed a particular challenge for Alex during her enrollment process. Her parents had requested a medical exemption based on her discharge papers, but Alex had ultimately decided to participate in a modified program that focused on individual fitness rather than team sports. She used the school's weight room during 6th period, when it was less crowded and she could work out without drawing attention to the impressive strength and conditioning that her military training had developed in her compact frame. The weight room at Lincoln High was well equipped with modern machines and free weights, though it paled in comparison to the facilities Alex had used on military bases. She followed a routine that maintained her fitness level without pushing her body beyond the limitations imposed by her injuries, carefully avoiding exercises that might aggravate the lingering effects of her concussion or put stress on the shoulder, where shrapnel had torn through muscle and tendon. Other students occasionally used the weight room during her assigned period, but they typically focused on their own workouts and left her alone. The few times someone had attempted to offer advice or assistance, Alex had politely declined, demonstrating a familiarity with the equipment that suggested more experience than her size and appearance would indicate. She preferred the solitude of individual exercise to the team-building activities that characterized most of the school's physical education program. Lunch period represented the most challenging part of Alex's day, a 30-minute window when the entire student body converged on the cafeteria and outdoor eating areas, creating a cacophony of voices and movement that could trigger her anxiety without warning. She had experimented with different strategies for managing this time, initially attempting to eat in the cafeteria before retreating to the library when the crowds became overwhelming. The library offered the quiet refuge she needed, with individual study carrels that provided privacy and a strict no-talking policy that made Concentration possible. What nobody at Lincoln High School knew about Alex Chen was that beneath her oversized hoodies and behind her thick-rimmed glasses lived someone who had survived situations that would break most adults twice her age. The quiet girl who flinched at sudden noises and preferred to eat lunch alone in the library carried within her 18 months of combat experience that had forged her into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Her military occupational specialty had been 6-8W combat medic, but her actual training had extended far beyond traditional medical care into realms that most soldiers never experienced. Alex's journey into the military had begun with a recruiter's visit to her previous high school in San Diego, where she had been struggling academically and socially after her parents' bitter divorce. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Martinez, had seen something in the quiet 17-year-old that others missed: a steel core wrapped in vulnerability, a young woman who needed direction and purpose more than she needed sympathy. He had painted a picture of military service that emphasized honor, duty, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world, concepts that resonated deeply with Alex's desire to escape the chaos of her family situation. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston had been a revelation for Alex. Despite being one of the smallest recruits in her company, she had excelled in ways that surprised even her drill sergeants. Her natural athleticism, combined with an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure, had made her a standout in combat training exercises. She had mastered the M4 carbine with remarkable speed, earning expert marksman status on her first qualification attempt, and had shown an intuitive understanding of small unit tactics that impressed her. Instructors. The advanced individual training that followed basic training had introduced Alex to the specialized skills of a combat medic, but her exceptional performance had caught the attention of instructors who recommended her for additional training programs. She had volunteered for every available course, driven by a desire to be the best soldier she could possibly be. This additional training had included advanced trauma care, helicopter operations, close quarters combat, and specialized weapons training that went far beyond what most medics received. Her first deployment assignment had been to forward operating Base Shank in Afghanistan's Logar province, one of the most dangerous areas of operation for American forces. The base was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and armored vehicles surrounded by mountains that provided perfect cover for enemy snipers and mortar teams. Alex had arrived in the country weighing barely 120 pounds, looking like someone's little sister who had accidentally wandered into a war zone. But her appearance had proven to be her greatest tactical advantage. The enemy fighters in Logar province had learned to target American medics, recognizing that eliminating medical support could have a devastating psychological impact on entire units. Traditional combat medics, usually large men carrying distinctive medical equipment, were easy to identify and prioritize as targets. Alex's small stature and unremarkable appearance allowed her to move through combat zones without immediately being recognized as a high-value target, a tactical advantage that had saved both her life and the lives of countless soldiers she treated. Her commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Stone, had quickly recognized Alex's unique capabilities and had begun assigning her to the most dangerous missions. She had participated in over 40 combat patrols during her first 6 months in the country, treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire while calling in helicopter evacuations and coordinating with close air support. Her medical bag contained not just traditional trauma supplies, but also specialized equipment for treating combat injuries that civilian medics never encountered: tourniquets for traumatic amputations, hemostatic agents for massive bleeding, and emergency surgical tools for procedures that couldn't wait for evacuation to a field hospital. The psychological profile that military psychologists had developed for Alex during her pre-deployment screening had noted her unusual combination of empathy and emotional detachment, traits that made her ideally suited for combat medicine. She could perform life-saving procedures on soldiers who were screaming in pain while remaining focused and methodical, compartmentalizing the emotional impact of what she was seeing until after the immediate crisis had passed. This ability to function under extreme stress had made her invaluable to her unit, but it had also begun to exact a psychological toll that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Her weapons training had extended far beyond the basic rifle marksmanship that all soldiers received. She had qualified on the M9 pistol, the M249 squad automatic weapon, and various crew-served weapons, but her real expertise lay in close-quarters combat and hand-to-hand fighting techniques. Her small size had initially been seen as a disadvantage in these areas, but she had compensated by developing lightning-fast reflexes and an encyclopedic knowledge of pressure points, joint locks, and leverage techniques that allowed her to disable opponents much larger than herself. The most intensive training Alex had received was in a program that the Army officially didn't acknowledge, a specialized course in defensive tactics for medical personnel operating in high-threat environments. This training had been conducted at a classified facility in North Carolina, where she had learned advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques specifically designed for situations where traditional weapons weren't available or appropriate. She had studied anatomy not just from a medical perspective, but from a tactical one, learning exactly how to apply pressure to nerve clusters and blood vessels to incapacitate attackers quickly and quietly. Her instructors in this program had been a mix of special forces veterans and martial arts experts who had developed fighting techniques specifically for smaller combatants facing larger opponents. They had taught her how to use speed and precision to overcome disadvantages in size and strength, emphasizing techniques that targeted vulnerable areas and used an opponent's momentum against them. Alex had absorbed these lessons with the same intensity she brought to her medical training, practicing until the movements became as automatic as checking vital signs or starting an IV. The psychological conditioning that accompanied this training had been designed to help soldiers overcome natural inhibitions about using violence, even in self-defense. Alex had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to separate her identity as a healer from her capabilities as a fighter when circumstances demanded it. This mental discipline had served her well during combat deployments, allowing her to switch seamlessly between treating wounded allies and engaging enemy combatants when medical personnel came under direct attack. Her service record, sealed away in military personnel files that would never be accessible to civilian authorities, documented incidents that read like scenes from an action movie. She had single-handedly defended a casualty collection point against enemy infiltrators, using improvised weapons and hand-to-hand combat techniques to neutralize 3 attackers, while protecting wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. She had crawled through enemy fire to reach wounded Americans, treating their injuries while directing artillery strikes against enemy positions. Using radio coordinates she calculated in her head, the decorations Alex had earned during her deployment told a story of extraordinary courage and competence under the most extreme circumstances possible. Her Purple Heart had come from the IED attack that ended her deployment, but she had been recommended for additional awards that recognized her combat effectiveness and life-saving actions under enemy fire. These commendations, however, remained classified due to the sensitive nature of some of her missions and the specialized training program she had completed. Her medical skills had been tested in ways that no civilian doctor ever experienced. She had performed emergency surgery using improvised tools in bombed-out buildings while enemy snipers fired at her position. She had amputated limbs in the field to save soldiers' lives when evacuation wasn't possible, making life and death decisions with information and resources that would challenge experienced trauma surgeons in fully equipped hospitals. Her success rate in keeping wounded soldiers alive until they could reach definitive medical care had been nearly perfect, a statistic that reflected both her technical competence and her absolute refusal to give up on anyone under her care. The Psychological impact of these experiences had begun to manifest during her final months in Afghanistan, though she had become expert at hiding the symptoms from her supervisors and fellow soldiers. The hypervigilance that served her well in combat zones became exhausting in rear area environments where constant threat assessment wasn't necessary. The emotional compartmentalization that allowed her to function during medical emergencies began to affect her ability to form normal social relationships with other soldiers. Her decision to accept a medical discharge had been influenced, not just by her physical injuries, but by a growing recognition that her psychological adaptation to combat was making it increasingly difficult to envision a future in the civilian world. The skills that made her extraordinarily effective as a combat medic, the ability to remain calm while people around her panicked, the capacity to make split-second decisions about life and death, the willingness to use violence when necessary to protect others, were not traits that translated easily to normal social interactions. The transition from military to civilian life had been complicated by the fact that most of Alex's actual experiences couldn't be discussed with therapists who lacked appropriate security clearances. The VA counselors who worked with her focused on standard PTSD treatment protocols that didn't account for the specialized training and classified operations that had shaped her military service. She had learned to discuss her symptoms and emotional responses without revealing the specific incidents that had caused them, a form of therapeutic compartmentalization that limited the effectiveness of her treatment. Now, sitting in high school classrooms and listening to teenagers complain about pop quizzes and cafeteria food, Alex carried within her the accumulated weight of experiences that would have overwhelmed most adults. She had seen things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, had made decisions that saved lives and took lives, had proven herself capable of extraordinary heroism and necessary violence in situations where failure meant death for herself and others. This knowledge existed alongside her genuine desire to heal from her trauma and build a normal life, creating an internal tension that manifested as the quiet withdrawal that her classmates interpreted as shyness. The irony wasn't lost on Alex that the same hands that had performed emergency surgery on wounded soldiers now struggled to hold a pencil steady during anxiety attacks, triggered by the sound of a car backfiring in the school parking lot. The tactical awareness that had kept her alive in Afghanistan now made it difficult to concentrate in classrooms, where she automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. The physical conditioning and combat skills that had made her formidable in war zones now felt like dangerous secrets that she had to carefully control to avoid accidentally hurting someone during a moment of triggered response. The social ecosystem at Lincoln High School operated according to unwritten rules that had been established over decades of teenage hierarchy, with certain students occupying positions of power that they wielded with the casual cruelty that came from never facing real consequences for their actions. At the apex of this system sat Madison Taylor, an 18-year-old senior whose combination of physical beauty, family wealth, and natural charisma had made her the undisputed queen of the school's social order since her freshman year. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with platinum blonde hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, Madison possessed the kind of effortless attractiveness that made other girls simultaneously admire and resent her. Madison's family had moved to Riverside when she was in middle school, her father having accepted a position as regional manager for a luxury car dealership that catered to the wealthy residents of the surrounding hills. The Taylors lived in a gated community called Vista Heights, where their 6-bedroom house featured a swimming pool, tennis court, and views of the San Bernardino Mountains that served as the backdrop for the Instagram posts that had garnered Madison over 15,000 followers. Her mother, a former model who now worked as a real estate agent specializing in high-end properties, had instilled in Madison the belief that appearance and social status were the most important currencies in life from her first day at Lincoln. "Hi, Madison had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to manipulate social dynamics to her advantage. She was intelligent enough to maintain solid grades without appearing to try too hard, athletic enough to make the varsity cheerleading squad as a sophomore, and wealthy enough to always have the latest fashion trends and electronic gadgets that made other students envious. Her natural leadership abilities had attracted a circle of followers who competed for her attention and approval, creating a hierarchy within her social group that reflected the broader power structure of the school. Madison's inner circle consisted of 2 lieutenants who served different functions in maintaining her social dominance. The first was Brooke Stevens, a tall brunette whose sharp features and even sharper tongue made her Madison's primary enforcer when it came to social warfare. Brooke came from a family of successful attorneys and had inherited both their argumentative nature and their ability to identify and exploit weakness in others. She was the one who gathered intelligence about potential threats to Madison's status, who spread rumors that could destroy reputations, and who delivered cutting remarks that could reduce other students to tears. The second member of Madison's core group was Haley Morrison, a redhead whose bubbly personality and infectious laugh masked a calculating intelligence that made her invaluable as Madison's strategist. Haley's father owned several successful restaurants in the area, and she had learned from watching his business operations how to build alliances, manipulate resources, and eliminate competition. She was responsible for organizing the social events that reinforced Madison's status, for managing relationships with other influential students, and for ensuring that Madison's group always had the information and connections they needed to maintain their position. Together, this trio had spent 4 years perfecting a system of social control that operated through a combination of inclusion and exclusion, reward and punishment, acceptance and rejection. They determined which parties were worth attending, which fashion trends were acceptable, which students were worthy of association, and which individuals needed to be marginalized or eliminated as potential threats. Their power was subtle but absolute, enforced through mechanisms that left no fingerprints but achieved devastating effectiveness in the closed ecosystem of high school social life. Madison's targeting of Chen had begun almost immediately after the new student's arrival at Lincoln High, though initially it had been more out of habit than genuine animosity. Madison possessed what she considered a sixth sense for identifying students who might challenge her position or disrupt the carefully maintained balance of her social system. Alex's obvious intelligence, combined with her mysterious background and her refusal to seek acceptance from established social groups, had triggered Madison's predatory instincts in ways that she didn't fully understand or question. The initial surveillance had been conducted by Haley, who had made discreet inquiries about Alex's family background, previous schools, and reasons for transferring to Lincoln High so late in her senior year. The information she gathered had been frustratingly sparse. Alex's parents were professors at UC Riverside. The family had moved frequently due to work obligations, and Alex had been homeschooled for several years before enrolling at Lincoln. This lack of detailed information had only increased Madison's suspicion that Alex was hiding something significant about her past. Brooke's assessment of Alex as a potential threat had focused on more immediate concerns about academic competition and social dynamics. Alex's obvious intelligence and her teachers' positive responses to her work had the potential to shift attention away from Madison's own academic achievements, which were an important component of her carefully crafted image as the perfect student. More troubling was Alex's apparent indifference to the social hierarchies that Madison had worked so hard to establish and maintain, an indifference that could prove contagious if other students began to question the importance of social status. Decision to actively target Alex had been made during one of Madison's regular strategy sessions with her inner circle, conducted in the privacy of Madison's BMW in the school parking lot where they could speak freely without risk of being overheard. These meetings, which occurred several times per week, served as planning sessions for social campaigns, intelligence briefings about potential threats or opportunities, and coordination sessions for activities that reinforced their group's dominance. Over the broader student body, Madison's initial approach to dealing with Alex had been characteristically subtle, designed to test the new student's responses and identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future operations. She had begun with seemingly casual comments about Alex's clothing choices, made loud enough for other students to hear, but delivered with the kind of plausible deniability that made direct confrontation difficult. When these verbal probes failed to produce the desired response of embarrassment or submission, Madison had escalated to more direct forms of social pressure. The campaign against Alex had intensified when Madison realized that traditional forms of high school bullying were proving ineffective against their target. Alex's apparent indifference to social exclusion, her lack of interest in peer approval, and her failure to respond to verbal taunts with either anger or tears had frustrated Madison in ways that challenged her understanding of how social power was supposed to function. Every successful campaign Madison had conducted in the past had eventually broken down her targets. Resistance through sustained pressure and escalating humiliation. But Alex seemed immune to these standard tactics. Brooke had suggested that Alex's resistance might be due to psychological problems or family dysfunction that made her incapable of normal social responses, a theory that had appealed to Madison because it allowed her to frame her campaign as necessary social correction rather than arbitrary cruelty. This rationalization had made it easier for Madison to justify increasingly aggressive tactics, including the recruitment of other students to participate in isolating and harassing Alex through coordinated campaigns of social exclusion and public humiliation. Haley's contribution to the campaign had been the strategic coordination of seemingly random incidents that were designed to make Alex's daily life at Lincoln High as unpleasant as possible without creating evidence of systematic harassment that might attract administrative attention. She had organized accidental collisions in crowded hallways, coordinated group conversations that stopped abruptly when Alex approached, and arranged for other students to occupy seats that Alex typically chose in various classrooms and common areas. The effectiveness of these tactics was measured not by Alex's visible responses, which remained frustratingly minimal, but by Madison's perception that she was successfully establishing dominance over a potential challenger to her authority. The campaign had become a matter of personal pride for Madison, who had never encountered a student who could resist her social pressure for extended periods. Alex's continued indifference to treatment that had broken other students represented a challenge to Madison's identity and status that she couldn't ignore without risking her position in the school's hierarchy. Madison's friends and followers had initially been enthusiastic participants in the campaign against Alex, viewing it as another opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to their leader while reinforcing their own positions within the group. However, as weeks passed without visible progress, some members of Madison's extended circle had begun to question the wisdom of continuing to target someone who seemed genuinely unaffected by their efforts. These doubts had created tension within Madison's group that she had been forced to address through a combination of peer pressure and veiled threats about the consequences of disloyalty, the escalation that would ultimately lead to the confrontation in the school bathroom had been driven by Madison's growing frustration with Alex's resistance and her need to demonstrate to her followers that her power remained absolute. She had become increasingly convinced that Alex's apparent immunity to social pressure was an act designed to make Madison appear weak or ineffective in front of other students. This interpretation of Alex's behavior had transformed what had begun as routine social manipulation into a personal vendetta that Madison was determined to resolve through increasingly aggressive means. The specific incident that triggered the bathroom confrontation had occurred during lunch period the previous week, when Alex had inadvertently disrupted one of Madison's carefully orchestrated social performances. Madison had been holding court at her usual table in the cafeteria, entertaining her followers with a dramatic retelling of her weekend shopping trip to Beverly Hills, when Alex had walked past carrying her lunch tray toward her usual seat in the corner. Something about Alex's posture or expression had struck Madison as dismissive or judgmental, though Alex had given no indication that she was even aware of Madison's presence. This perceived slight had been the final straw for Madison, who had interpreted Alex's behavior as a deliberate challenge to her authority that demanded immediate and decisive response. She had spent the remainder of the lunch period planning a confrontation that would finally break Alex's resistance while demonstrating to the entire school that Madison's power was not to be questioned or ignored. The bathroom setting had been chosen specifically because it offered privacy for more aggressive tactics while ensuring that any confrontation would be witnessed by other students who could spread word of Madison's dominance throughout the school. The psychological profile that a trained observer might have developed for Madison would have revealed a young woman whose outward confidence masked deep insecurities about her worth and identity beyond her physical appearance and social status. Her need to control and dominate others stemmed from fears about her own adequacy that she had never learned to address through healthy means. Alex's indifference to social approval represented a fundamental threat to Madison's worldview, challenging the assumptions about human nature and social dynamics that formed the foundation of her identity and self-worth. The systematic campaign of harassment that Madison Taylor and her followers launched against Chen unfolded with the methodical precision of a military operation. Though none of the perpetrators recognized the cruel irony of using tactical approaches against someone who had actually experienced real warfare. What began as casual social exclusion evolved into a coordinated effort designed to make every moment of Alex's school day an exercise in psychological endurance, testing limits that Madison couldn't possibly understand. The first phase of escalated harassment focused on Alex's morning routine, which Madison had observed and cataloged with the attention to detail of a surveillance operative. Alex's habit of arriving exactly 15 minutes before first period and proceeding directly to her locker had made her predictable, and Madison exploited this predictability by positioning her followers at strategic points along Alex's route. Brooke would occupy the water fountain near Alex's locker, engaging in loud conversations with other students about weekend parties and social events that Alex obviously hadn't been invited to attend. These conversations were carefully crafted to sound natural while delivering pointed messages about social exclusion and isolation. Brooke would discuss plans for group study sessions, shopping trips to the mall, and movie nights at Madison's house, always speaking just loudly enough for Alex to overhear while making it clear through tone and body language that such invitations were reserved for students who belonged to the accepted social circles. The psychological impact was designed to be cumulative, reminding Alex daily that she existed outside the social fabric of Lincoln High School. Haley's role in these morning campaigns involved more subtle forms of territorial marking that established Madison's group's dominance over shared spaces. She would arrive early with 2 or 3 other students and occupy the seating area near Alex's locker, spreading their backpacks and personal belongings across multiple chairs and benches in a way that claimed the entire space as their exclusive domain. When Alex approached to access her locker, she would find herself surrounded by Madison's followers who would continue their conversations without acknowledging her presence, treating her like an invisible obstacle that they had to navigate around. Morning locker harassment escalated when Madison discovered that Alex kept her textbooks organized in a specific pattern that suggested military-level attention to detail, though she misinterpreted this precision as obsessive-compulsive behavior that could be exploited. Madison began a campaign of subtle disruption, having her followers brush against Alex's locker door as they passed, causing it to slam shut while Alex was retrieving books. They would accidentally bump into Alex while she was loading her backpack, causing papers to scatter and forcing her to scramble to collect her materials while other students stepped around her. The hallway harassment between classes represented the most psychologically sophisticated element of Madison's campaign. Utilizing the natural chaos of Lincoln High's corridors during passing periods to create seemingly accidental encounters that were actually carefully orchestrated intimidation tactics. Madison had studied the timing of Alex's movements between classrooms and had positioned her followers at strategic choke points where they could create maximum disruption while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Brooke specialized in the hallway sandwich technique, where she would walk directly in front of Alex while another member of Madison's group walked behind her, controlling her pace and direction through the crowded corridors. This forced Alex to move at their speed rather than her own, disrupting the carefully timed routine that helped her manage anxiety while creating a subtle but unmistakable demonstration of their power to control her movements. When Alex tried to step around them or change her route, she would find her path blocked by other members of the group, who appeared to be engaged in innocent conversations, but were actually positioned to prevent her escape. The bathroom harassment represented Madison's most aggressive and personal attacks, taking advantage of the reduced supervision in these areas to engage in behavior that would have been impossible in classrooms or other monitored spaces. Madison had identified the second-floor bathroom near the science wing as Alex's preferred location, probably because it was less crowded during most periods and offered the privacy that Alex seemed to crave. This preference became a vulnerability that Madison exploited with increasing frequency and intensity. The initial bathroom incidents involved Madison and her followers arriving shortly after Alex, filling the space with loud conversations and aggressive use of the facilities that made it impossible for Alex to complete her business in peace. They would slam stall doors, run water at full volume, and engage in discussions about other students that carried clear undertones of social threat and exclusion. The message was unmistakable. Even the most private spaces at Lincoln High were subject to Madison's control and surveillance. The cafeteria campaign represented perhaps the most publicly humiliating aspect of Madison's harassment strategy, utilizing the social dynamics of the lunch period to demonstrate Alex's isolation to the entire student body. Madison had recognized that Alex's choice to eat alone in the corner of the cafeteria was both a defensive strategy and a potential vulnerability, and she had developed a series of tactics designed to make even this solitary activity unbearable. Accidental food spills began during Alex's third week at Lincoln High, when Haley had stumbled while carrying a tray of spaghetti and meat sauce, somehow managing to splash Alex's white sweater with red sauce while avoiding any damage to her own clothing. The incident had been perfectly timed to occur when the cafeteria was most crowded, ensuring maximum visibility while the profuse apologies and offers to help clean up had provided perfect cover for the deliberate nature of the attack. These food-related incidents escalated in frequency and severity over the following weeks. Brooke had perfected the technique of walking past Alex's table while carrying drinks, managing to create spills that soaked Alex's homework or textbooks while appearing to be genuine accidents caused by the crowded conditions in the cafeteria. Madison herself had participated in these attacks, once delivering a devastating blow to Alex's calculus textbook by accidentally knocking over a large soda that had been balanced precariously on the edge of Alex's table. The library harassment represented Madison's attempt to invade the one space where Alex had found genuine refuge from the social pressures of high school life. Madison had initially been reluctant to target Alex in the library because the strict rules about noise and behavior limited the tactics she could employ. But Alex's obvious comfort in this environment had made it too tempting a target to ignore. The library campaign required more subtlety than Madison's other operations, but it proved equally effective at creating psychological pressure. The strategy involved having members of Madison's group gradually occupy tables near Alex's preferred study area, engaging in whispered conversations that were just loud enough to be distracting, while remaining within the library's noise guidelines. These conversations would include pointed references to Alex's appearance, her social isolation, and speculation about her background that was designed to make her feel observed and discussed, even in spaces where she had expected privacy and anonymity. The gym class harassment represented a particularly cruel exploitation of Alex's apparent physical limitations and anxiety around competitive activities. Madison had observed that Alex participated in a modified physical education program that focused on individual fitness rather than team sports, and she had interpreted this accommodation as evidence of weakness that could be exploited. During the periods when both students were in the gymnasium, Madison would arrange for her followers to occupy equipment near Alex's workout area, engaging in loud conversations about their own athletic achievements while making pointed comments about students who couldn't handle normal physical education requirements. The escalation pattern that characterized Madison's campaign followed a predictable trajectory that reflected her growing frustration with Alex's apparent immunity to traditional high school social pressure. Each failed attempt to provoke a visible emotional response led to more aggressive tactics, creating a cycle of escalation that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, while maintaining the facade of plausible deniability that protected Madison from official consequences. The clothing harassment had begun with subtle comments about Alex's fashion choices, delivered as seemingly helpful observations about how she might improve her appearance or fit in better with other students. When these suggestions failed to produce the desired changes in Alex's behavior or wardrobe, Madison had escalated to more direct attacks on Alex's appearance, recruiting other students to participate in coordinated campaigns of criticism that targeted everything from Alex's hairstyle to her choice of eyeglasses. The academic harassment represented Madison's recognition that Alex's obvious intelligence and strong classroom performance could potentially threaten her own status as one of Lincoln High's top students. Madison had begun asking pointed questions about Alex's grades and test scores, spreading rumors about possible cheating or academic dishonesty that were designed to undermine Alex's credibility with teachers and other students. When these attacks failed to damage Alex's academic standing, Madison had escalated to more direct interference with Alex's educational activities. The social media campaign that accompanied Madison's in-person harassment utilized platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok to extend the psychological pressure beyond school hours and into Alex's home environment. Madison had created carefully crafted posts that referenced Alex without naming her directly, using inside jokes and coded language that would be recognizable to other Lincoln High students while remaining deniable if questioned by school administrators or parents. The cumulative effect of these sustained attacks was designed to create a psychological environment where Alex would feel constantly observed, judged, and threatened, even during moments when Madison and her followers were not physically present. The campaign represented a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare that utilized multiple pressure points and attack vectors to create maximum stress while minimizing the risk of official intervention or consequences. The breaking point that would ultimately trigger the bathroom confrontation was approaching as Madison's frustration with Alex's resistance reached critical levels, setting the stage for an escalation that would finally reveal the true nature of the quiet transfer student who had proven so mysteriously immune to the social pressures that controlled every other student at Lincoln High School. Alex Chen's internal landscape during those weeks of systematic harassment resembled a battlefield where two distinct versions of herself waged a constant psychological war, each representing fundamentally different approaches to survival and self-preservation. The first was the civilian identity she was desperately trying to construct, a quiet, studious teenager who wanted nothing more than to heal from her trauma and build a normal life among peers who had never experienced anything more dangerous than a failed exam or a broken heart. The second was the combat veteran who had survived 18 months in Afghanistan through hypervigilance, tactical thinking, and the absolute certainty that hesitation in the face of genuine threat meant death. Every morning when Alex woke up, in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the stuffed animals and academic awards that represented the life she had lived before military service, she made a conscious decision to suppress the warrior identity that had kept her alive overseas. She would look at herself in the mirror and practice the facial expressions and body language of a normal teenager, forcing her shoulders to slouch slightly, training her eyes to avoid the constant scanning that had become second nature in combat zones, reminding herself that the hypervigilance that had saved her life in Afghanistan was counterproductive. In the hallways of Lincoln High School, the meditation techniques that her VA therapist had taught her were supposed to help manage the anxiety and anger that built up throughout each school day. But Alex found herself modifying these exercises in ways that her counselor probably wouldn't have approved. Instead of focusing on peaceful imagery and breathing techniques designed to promote relaxation, Alex found herself mentally rehearsing the hand-to-hand combat sequences that had been drilled into her during specialized training. The familiar patterns of movement and response served as a form of psychological comfort, reminding her that she possessed capabilities that could end any physical threat in seconds. Her father's voice echoed constantly in her mind during these internal struggles, repeating the lessons about honor, restraint, and the proper use of force that had been central to her upbringing in a military family. Colonel Chen had taught his daughter that true strength was demonstrated through discipline and self-control, that violence should always be a last resort, employed only when all other options had been exhausted. These principles had guided Alex's behavior throughout her deployment, helping her maintain her humanity while operating in an environment where moral boundaries were constantly tested. The psychological training that Alex had received as part of her specialized medical program had included extensive instruction in stress management and emotional compartmentalization, skills that were essential for combat medics who needed to function effectively while treating horrific injuries under enemy fire. She had learned to create mental barriers between different aspects of her identity, separating her role as a healer from her capabilities as a warrior, maintaining her compassion for human suffering, while remaining capable of decisive action when circumstances demanded it. These same compartmentalization techniques were now being tested in ways that their designers had never intended. As Alex struggled to maintain her civilian identity while her combat instincts screamed warnings about the escalating pattern of harassment she was experiencing. Every incident with Madison and her followers triggered threat assessment protocols that had been ingrained through months of survival training, forcing Alex to consciously override responses that had been conditioned through life-or-death experiences. In combat zones, the sleep deprivation that had become a constant factor in Alex's life was partly due to the nightmares that still plagued her months after her medical discharge, but increasingly it was caused by the mental energy required to suppress her trained responses to what her subconscious recognized as a developing tactical situation. Her dreams were filled with vivid scenarios where she defended herself against Madison's attacks using the combat techniques that had been drilled into her until they became automatic responses, scenarios that left her waking up in cold sweats, with her heart racing and her hands shaking. The physical symptoms of her internal conflict were becoming increasingly difficult to hide from her parents and teachers. The tension headaches that had initially been attributed to her concussion were now clearly related to the constant stress of maintaining emotional control in situations that triggered her combat training. Her hands would tremble slightly when she tried to take notes, not from fear or anxiety, but from the physical effort required to suppress the muscle memory of weapons handling and defensive positioning that had been conditioned through thousands of hours of training. Alex's academic performance, which had initially provided a refuge from the social pressures of high school life, was beginning to suffer as more of her mental energy was devoted to managing the psychological warfare being conducted by Madison's group. The calculus problems that had once provided a welcome distraction from her trauma now seemed trivial compared to the tactical calculations her mind was constantly performing, analyzing sight lines and escape routes, assessing potential weapons and defensive positions, evaluating the physical capabilities and behavioral patterns of her tormentors. The conversations with her VA therapist had become increasingly difficult as Alex struggled to explain her symptoms without revealing the specialized training that made her situation fundamentally different from other veterans dealing with PTSD. The standard therapeutic approaches that focused on avoiding triggers and managing anxiety responses were inadequate for someone whose triggers were activating highly trained combat reflexes rather than simple fear responses. Alex found herself editing her descriptions of incidents at school, removing details that might reveal the tactical nature of her thinking or the specific capabilities she was working so hard to suppress. Her parents had begun to notice changes in Alex's behavior that went beyond the expected adjustment difficulties of a combat veteran returning to civilian life. Her mother had commented on the way Alex now positioned herself at the dinner table with her back to the wall and a clear view of all entrances to the room, habits that had developed during her deployment but were now becoming more pronounced rather than fading with time. Her father, drawing on his own military experience, recognized signs of operational stress that suggested his daughter was dealing with ongoing threats rather than simply processing past trauma. The philosophical struggle that consumed much of Alex's internal dialogue centered on the question of whether her current situation actually constituted a legitimate threat that justified the use of her combat training, or whether it was simply typical teenage social conflict that required civilian solutions. Her military training had taught her to err on the side of caution when assessing potential threats, but her desire to integrate into civilian society demanded that she interpret Madison's harassment as harmless adolescent behavior rather than the systematic psychological warfare that her tactical training told her it actually represented. The moral framework that guided Alex's decision-making process had been shaped by military ethics training that emphasized the protection of innocent civilians and the proportional use of force in response to genuine threats. The challenge she faced at Lincoln High School was determining whether Madison and her followers qualified as legitimate threats that warranted defensive action, or whether they were simply misguided teenagers whose behavior, while cruel, didn't rise to the level that would justify the use of potentially lethal force by a trained combat veteran. The isolation that Alex experienced at Lincoln High School was compounded by her recognition that she couldn't discuss her real concerns with anyone who might understand the full scope of her dilemma. Her parents, despite their military backgrounds, had never received the specialized combat training that made Alex's situation unique. Her VA therapist, while experienced in treating PTSD, lacked the security clearance necessary to discuss the classified training programs that had shaped Alex's capabilities. Her former military colleagues were thousands of miles away, dealing with their own transition challenges, and couldn't provide guidance about managing combat skills in a high school environment. The weight of keeping her military background secret had initially seemed like a reasonable privacy decision, but it was now becoming a psychological burden that complicated every social interaction at school. Alex found herself constantly editing her responses to casual questions about her past, inventing plausible stories about her family's frequent moves and her previous educational experiences while carefully avoiding any references to the military service that had defined the most important years of her life. The tactical awareness that had kept Alex alive in Afghanistan was now creating a constant state of low-level stress as her trained senses picked up details about her environment that civilian teenagers would never notice or consider significant. She automatically cataloged the locations of potential weapons in every classroom, assessed the physical capabilities of students and teachers she encountered, and maintained mental maps of escape routes and defensive positions that could be utilized if the social conflict escalated to physical violence. The recognition that her tormentors had no understanding of the psychological and physical capabilities they were testing added another layer of complexity to Alex's internal struggle. Madison, Brooke, and Haley were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a typical transfer student who could be broken through sustained social pressure, completely unaware that their target was someone who had been trained to resist interrogation, withstand psychological pressure, and respond to genuine threats with overwhelming force. The countdown to confrontation was becoming inevitable as Alex's carefully constructed civilian identity began to crack under the sustained pressure of Madison's campaign and the combat. Veteran beneath the surface started to assert control over situations that her training identified as tactical problems, requiring direct action solutions. The internal war between these two identities was approaching a resolution that would fundamentally change the dynamics at Lincoln High School and reveal the true nature of the quiet transfer student who had been absorbing abuse with the patience of someone who knew exactly how much damage she could inflict if she chose to abandon restraint. The conventional solutions that Chen attempted to pursue followed the textbook approach that any guidance counselor would recommend to a student experiencing harassment, but each failed attempt only served to demonstrate how fundamentally different her situation was from typical high school social conflicts. Her first effort to address the problem through official channels came during her 4th week at Lincoln High, when the accumulated stress of Madison's campaign had begun to interfere with her sleep patterns and academic concentration to a degree that she could no longer ignore. Mrs. Patricia Hoffman, Lincoln High's head guidance counselor, was a well-meaning woman in her late 50s who had spent 3 decades helping teenagers navigate the complex social and academic challenges of high school life. Her office, decorated with motivational posters and comfortable furniture designed to encourage student confidence, had witnessed thousands of conversations about bullying, academic pressure, family problems, and social anxiety. However, Mrs. Hoffman had never counseled a student whose background included classified military training and combat experience, a fact that immediately complicated her ability to understand and address Alex's situation. Alex's initial meeting with Mrs. Hoffman had been carefully prepared, with Alex practicing how to describe her experiences in terms that would convey the seriousness of the harassment without revealing details about her military background that might lead to questions she couldn't answer. She had rehearsed explanations for her emotional responses that focused on generic stress and adjustment difficulties rather than the specific triggers that activated her combat training. The result was a conversation that felt artificial and incomplete, with both participants struggling to address problems they couldn't fully discuss. Mrs. Hoffman's response to Alex's carefully edited account of the harassment had been predictably bureaucratic, focusing on documentation procedures and official complaint processes that were designed to protect the school district from liability rather than provide meaningful relief to victimized students. She had explained the importance of maintaining detailed records of incidents, including dates, times, witnesses, and specific descriptions of behavior that violated the school's anti-bullying policies. This approach, while legally sound, was completely inadequate for addressing the sophisticated psychological warfare that Madison's group was conducting. The documentation process itself became another source of frustration for Alex, who found herself trying to explain incidents that had been carefully designed to maintain plausible deniability and avoid creating evidence of systematic harassment. How could she document the psychological impact of being surrounded by Madison's followers in hallways when they could claim they were simply walking to class? How could she prove that the accidental spills and collisions were deliberate when the perpetrators offered convincing apologies and explanations for their clumsiness? Hoffman's suggestion that Alex try to fit in better by joining clubs or sports teams demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both the nature of the harassment and Alex's psychological state. The guidance counselor's assumption that social isolation was the root cause of the problem, rather than a defensive strategy developed by someone with extensive training in threat assessment, led to recommendations that would have actually increased Alex's vulnerability by forcing her into situations where Madison's group could more easily target her. The academic solutions that Mrs. Hoffman proposed were equally misguided, based on the assumption that Alex's problems were related to normal teenage adjustment issues rather than the unique challenges faced by a combat veteran trying to integrate into civilian society. Suggestions about study groups and peer tutoring programs ignored the fact that Alex's academic performance was already excellent, and that her difficulties were related to managing psychological trauma rather than learning challenges. Alex's attempt to address the harassment through informal channels proved equally unsuccessful, highlighting the social dynamics that made Madison's campaign so effective. When Alex had finally worked up the courage to approach a classmate who had witnessed one of the more obvious incidents of harassment, she had discovered that Madison's influence extended far beyond her inner circle. Students who might have been sympathetic to Alex's situation were reluctant to intervene or provide support because they feared becoming targets themselves. The bystander effect that Alex encountered at Lincoln High was particularly pronounced because Madison's group had spent years establishing their dominance through strategic use of social rewards and punishments. Students who cooperated with Madison's campaigns were rewarded with inclusion in desirable social activities, while those who showed sympathy for her targets found themselves subjected to the same treatment. This created an environment where intervention on behalf of victims was seen as both futile and potentially dangerous to one's own social standing. Alex's military training had included extensive instruction in the importance of local intelligence and community support when operating in hostile territory, but the social dynamics of high school made it impossible to develop the kind of relationships that would provide reliable information or assistance. The students who might have been willing to help were generally those who existed on the margins of the social hierarchy themselves, lacking the influence or resources to effectively oppose Madison's campaign. The teacher intervention that Alex had hoped might provide relief from the harassment proved to be another dead end, hampered by the same plausible deniability that made Madison's tactics so difficult to document officially. When Alex had finally gathered the courage to speak privately with Mr. Patterson, her American history teacher, about the incidents that were occurring in his classroom, she had discovered that adults were often oblivious to the subtle forms of psychological warfare that teenagers employed against each other. Mr. Patterson's response to Alex's concerns had been well-intentioned but ineffective, limited by his lack of training in recognizing sophisticated bullying tactics and his assumption that direct confrontation would resolve the problem. His announcement to the class about the importance of treating all students with respect had only served to alert Madison's group that Alex was seeking adult intervention, leading to an escalation in their harassment campaign rather than the desired cessation. The administrative response to Alex's formal complaint had been predictably bureaucratic, focusing on liability management and policy compliance rather than addressing the actual safety and welfare concerns that motivated the quoted complaint. Vice Principal Margaret Chen, no relation to Alex despite the shared surname, had conducted the kind of perfunctory investigation that was designed to demonstrate due diligence for legal purposes rather than genuinely resolve the underlying conflict. Interviews that Vice Principal Chen conducted with Madison Brooke and Haley had been exercises in professional preparation and coordinated denial, with each girl providing carefully rehearsed explanations for the incidents that Alex had reported. Their responses demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate adult perceptions while maintaining their campaign of harassment. utilizing the same social skills that had made them successful in managing peer relationships to deceive school administrators. Madison's performance during her administrative interview had been particularly impressive, combining just the right amount of surprise and concern about Alex's allegations with subtle suggestions that the new student might be having difficulty adjusting to normal social interactions. Her tearful explanation of her own attempts to befriend Alex, supported by carefully selected witnesses who could testify to her kindness and inclusivity, had successfully reframed the narrative from one of systematic harassment to one of misunderstood social overtures. At the mediation session that Vice Principal Chen had arranged as a compromise solution between Alex's request for disciplinary action and the lack of conclusive evidence of wrongdoing had been another exercise in frustration for Alex. The process, designed to facilitate communication and understanding between conflicting parties, was completely inappropriate for addressing the power dynamics that characterized Madison's harassment campaign. Alex's military training had included instruction in negotiation and conflict resolution, but those skills were designed for situations involving roughly equal parties with legitimate grievances on both sides. The mediation session at Lincoln High involved a victim confronting her tormentors in a supervised setting that actually provided Madison's group with additional opportunities to demonstrate their control over the situation while maintaining their facade of innocent victimhood. The psychological impact of watching Madison, Brooke, and Haley manipulate the mediation process with practiced ease had been particularly damaging to Alex's faith in civilian institutions and procedures. Their ability to present themselves as confused and hurt by Alex's accusations while subtly reinforcing their threats and dominance had demonstrated a level of sophistication that most adults were unprepared to recognize or address effectively. Follow-up procedures that Vice Principal Chen had implemented were designed to monitor the situation and prevent further incidents, but they were based on the assumption that the harassment had been the result of misunderstanding rather than deliberate psychological warfare. The periodic check-ins with Alex about her adjustment to Lincoln High and her relationships with other students were well-intentioned, but failed to address the ongoing campaign that Madison's group was conducting with increased subtlety and sophistication. Alex's growing recognition that the conventional solutions available through official channels were inadequate to address her situation had begun to shift her thinking toward more direct approaches that drew on her military training rather than civilian conflict resolution strategies. The failure of adults to recognize or effectively respond to the sophisticated psychological warfare being conducted against her had reinforced lessons from her combat experience about the importance of self-reliance and personal responsibility for one's own safety and security. The internal debate that consumed more and more of Alex's mental energy centered on the question of when civilian solutions had been sufficiently exhausted to justify transitioning to more direct approaches that utilized her specialized training. Her military ethics training had emphasized the importance of proportional response and the exhaustion of diplomatic alternatives before resorting to force, but it had also taught her to recognize when she was operating in an environment where conventional rules and procedures were inadequate to address genuine threats. The countdown to direct action was accelerating as Alex's patience with ineffective civilian solutions reached its limits and her combat training began to assert itself as the only reliable means of addressing the systematic harassment that was interfering with her ability to function in what should have been a safe environment. The morning of October 5th began like every other day at Lincoln High School with Alex Chen following her precisely timed routine that had become as automatic as breathing. During her weeks of careful adaptation to civilian life, she arrived at school at exactly 7:45, parked in her usual spot in the back corner of the student lot, and made her way through the corridors with the measured pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy while maintaining constant situational awareness. The familiar weight of her backpack, the the soft squeak of her sneakers against polished floors, and the distant hum of morning conversations all registered in her consciousness as normal background, elements of an environment she had mapped and categorized with military precision. What Alex couldn't have anticipated was that Madison Taylor had spent the previous evening planning what she intended to be the final phase of her harassment campaign, a confrontation designed to break Alex's mysterious resistance once and for all, while demonstrating to the entire school that Madison's authority was absolute and unquestionable. The planning session had taken place in Madison's bedroom, a shrine to teenage privilege decorated with designer clothing, expensive electronics, and the kind of carefully curated aesthetic that required constant maintenance and unlimited financial resources. Madison had invited Brooke and Haley for what she called a strategy meeting. Though the actual purpose was to coordinate the most aggressive assault they had yet attempted on Alex's psychological defenses. The three girls had spent hours analyzing Alex's daily routine, identifying vulnerabilities in her carefully constructed schedule, and developing scenarios that would force a confrontation in an environment where they could control all the variables, while minimizing the risk of adult intervention. The bathroom near the science wing had been selected as the optimal location for this final confrontation because it offered several tactical advantages that Madison's group could exploit. The location was far enough from the main administrative offices to reduce the likelihood of immediate intervention, but close enough to high-traffic areas to ensure that word of the confrontation would spread quickly throughout the school. The space itself was relatively small and contained, making it impossible for Alex to avoid direct engagement, while providing excellent acoustics for the kind of verbal humiliation that Madison specialized in delivering. Madison's plan involved a calculated escalation that would begin with verbal harassment designed to provoke an emotional response, progress to physical intimidation that stopped just short of actual assault, and culminate in the destruction of Alex's personal property, in a way that would demonstrate the futility of resistance while avoiding actions that could result in serious disciplinary consequences. The script had been rehearsed carefully, with each participant assigned specific roles that would maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about their actual intentions. The timing of the assault had been coordinated to coincide with the period between third and fourth periods, when the bathroom would be most likely to contain witnesses who could spread word of Madison's dominance throughout the school while remaining empty enough to prevent adult supervision. Madison had spent weeks observing Alex's bathroom habits, noting that she typically used this particular facility during this specific time period, creating a predictable pattern that could be exploited for maximum strategic advantage. Alex's morning had proceeded normally through her first 3 classes, with the usual background stress of managing her psychological symptoms while maintaining her academic performance and avoiding unnecessary social interactions. Her advanced placement chemistry class had focused on molecular bonding theories that reminded her of the explosive chemistry she had studied during her military training, creating brief moments of cognitive dissonance as her mind automatically applied tactical applications to academic concepts that were supposed to be purely theoretical. The transition to her 4th period, American literature class, required Alex to traverse the science wing corridor, a route that took her past the bathroom, where Madison and her followers were waiting with the patience of predators who had identified the perfect moment to strike. Alex's tactical awareness, honed through months of survival in combat zones where inattention could be fatal, registered the unusual quiet in the corridor and the absence of normal student traffic that typically characterized passing periods. As Alex approached the bathroom door, her subconscious mind processed dozens of environmental cues that suggested an abnormal situation: the positioning of students in the hallway, the quality of silence that indicated people holding their breath in anticipation, the subtle changes in body language that telegraphed aggressive intent to anyone trained to recognize such signals. Her civilian identity urged her to interpret these signs as normal variations in the school environment, while her combat training screamed warnings about an imminent ambush that required immediate tactical response. The decision to enter the bathroom despite her growing sense of unease reflected Alex's continued commitment to maintaining her civilian identity and her belief that conventional social conflicts could be managed through patience and de-escalation techniques. Her military training had taught her to trust her instincts about danger, but her desire to integrate into normal teenage life had created a psychological framework that consistently overruled tactical assessments in favor of social normalcy. Madison's opening gambit came the moment Alex stepped through the bathroom door, with the three girls positioned to block any immediate escape, while creating a triangular formation that maximized their psychological dominance over the confined space. Madison stood directly in front of the exit, her arms crossed, and her expression displaying the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from finally having an opponent exactly where you want them. Brooke positioned herself near the sinks, ready to provide flanking support if Alex attempted to avoid direct confrontation, while Haley controlled the area near the stalls, ensuring that no avenue of retreat remained available. Well, Madison announced, her voice carrying across the tiled space with an authority that had been cultivated through years of social dominance. Look who finally decided to show up where we could have a private conversation. I think it's time we discussed your attitude problem, Alex. The words themselves were relatively mild compared to the psychological warfare that Madison's group had been conducting for weeks, but the context transformed them into a clear declaration of hostile intent that triggered every alarm system in Alex's combat-trained mind. The confined space, the blocked exits, the coordinated positioning of multiple opponents, and the obvious premeditation of the encounter all registered as indicators of a tactical situation that required immediate threat assessment and potential defensive action. Alex's response reflected the internal struggle between her civilian and military identities that had been consuming increasing amounts of her mental energy over the past weeks. Her voice remained calm and level as she replied, "I'm just trying to use the bathroom, Madison. I don't want any trouble with you or anyone else." This attempt at de-escalation, which would have been appropriate in most civilian conflicts, was interpreted by Madison as evidence of weakness and fear that could be exploited to achieve total psychological dominance. The response that Madison had been hoping for, tears, pleading, or angry outbursts that would provide justification for further escalation, was not forthcoming. But Alex's obvious desire to avoid confrontation was seen as proof that sustained pressure would eventually break her resistance. Brooke's contribution to the verbal assault focused on Alex's appearance and social isolation, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological cruelty. "You know what your problem is, Rodriguez?" she said, deliberately mispronouncing Alex's surname as a form of casual racism. "You think you're better than everyone else with your weird clothes and your antisocial attitude. Newsflash, nobody wants you here." The personal attacks continued to escalate as Haley joined the verbal assault, her usually bubbly personality replaced by a vicious cruelty that revealed the calculating intelligence behind her cheerful facade. "Maybe if you tried to look normal, instead of like some homeless refugee, people might actually want to talk to you. But I guess that's too much effort for someone who can't even be bothered to participate in normal social activities." Alex's military training had included extensive instruction in resisting psychological pressure and interrogation techniques, but those skills had been developed for situations involving enemy combatants rather than teenage girls wielding social criticism as weapons. The personal nature of the attacks, combined with the confined space and blocked exits, began to activate stress responses that her body associated with genuine threats to her survival rather than civilian social conflicts. The pivotal moment that would transform a typical high school bullying incident into something far more serious came when Madison decided that verbal harassment alone was insufficient to achieve her goals. Her frustration with Alex's continued resistance to psychological pressure had been building for weeks, and the privacy of the bathroom setting provided an opportunity to escalate beyond the verbal attacks that had proven ineffective in breaking Alex's mysterious composure. Madison's decision to escalate to physical intimidation began with seemingly minor actions, stepping closer to Alex, invading her personal space, using body language that conveyed aggressive intent while remaining technically within the bounds of behavior that could be dismissed as normal teenage posturing. These actions, however, triggered responses in Alex's combat-trained mind that civilian teenagers couldn't possibly understand or anticipate. The final straw came when Madison, frustrated by Alex's refusal to show fear or submission, made the catastrophic decision to grab Alex's backpack and empty its contents across the bathroom floor. The textbooks, notebooks, and carefully organized school supplies scattered across the tiles in a display of dominance that was designed to demonstrate Madison's power to disrupt and control every aspect of Alex's carefully structured existence. Among the scattered items was Alex's worn copy of Medic, a novel of the Korean War, a book that had been given to her by her commanding officer in Afghanistan and had become a touchstone for maintaining her identity as a healer rather than simply a warrior. The sight of this personally meaningful object being treated as refuse by someone who couldn't possibly understand its significance created a psychological break that allowed Alex's suppressed combat identity to finally assert itself after weeks of careful containment. The transformation that occurred in Alex during that moment was invisible to Madison and her followers, but it represented a fundamental shift from defensive civilian mode to offensive military response that would change everything about the situation they thought they controlled. The quiet transfer student who had absorbed months of abuse with seemingly infinite patience was gone, replaced by someone whose combat training was about to be demonstrated in ways that none of them could have imagined possible. The transformation that occurred within Alex Chen happened in the space between heartbeats, a psychological shift so complete and instantaneous that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the small bathroom. The scattered contents of her backpack, textbooks, pens, and that precious worn novel lay across the floor like casualties of war, and in that moment, every lesson her father had taught her about restraint and proportional response was overwhelmed by months of accumulated rage and the sight of her most treasured possession being treated like garbage by people who understood nothing about sacrifice or honor. Madison was still laughing at her display of dominance, her voice echoing off the tiled walls as she kicked at Alex's scattered belongings with casual cruelty. "Oh, look at this," she said, bending down to pick up the military novel. "What kind of loser reads books about war? Are you fantasizing about being some kind of soldier?" She held the book up mockingly, her perfectly manicured fingers leaving smudges on the cover that had been carefully preserved through 2 deployments and countless lonely nights in forward operating bases. Alex's response was so quiet that Madison had to strain to hear it over the ambient noise of the school building. "Put it down," she said, her voice carrying a quality that none of the 3 girls had ever heard before, not the pleading tone of a victim or the angry shout of someone losing control, but the deadly calm of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be undone. The warning went unheeded because Madison, Brooke, and Haley were operating under assumptions about social dynamics and teenage behavior that bore no resemblance to the reality of their situation. They had no framework for understanding that they were no longer dealing with a high school transfer student, but with someone whose muscle memory had been conditioned through thousands of hours of training to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. Madison's mistake was in interpreting Alex's stillness as paralysis rather than the coiled readiness of a predator preparing to strike. "Or what?" she taunted, raising the book higher as if to tear it in half. "What are you going to do about it, little mouse? Cry, run to the principal? We've already established that nobody cares about your problems." The movement that followed was so fast that none of the three girls fully processed what had happened until it was over. Alex's right hand shot forward in a textbook palm strike that caught Madison directly in the solar plexus, delivered with the precise force and angle that had been drilled into her during close-quarters combat training. The strike was designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, targeting the nerve cluster that would temporarily paralyze the diaphragm and leave the recipient gasping for air while remaining conscious enough to understand what had happened. Madison's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to shock to panic in the space of a single second as her body's autonomic systems shut down under the precise neural disruption that Alex's strike had delivered. The book fell from her hands as she doubled over, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her respiratory system struggled to remember how to function. Her eyes went wide with terror as she realized that she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but fold in on herself, while her body fought to recover from the assault on her nervous system. Before Brooke could process what had happened to her leader, Alex was already moving toward her with the fluid grace of someone whose combat training had been refined through life-or-death encounters. Brooke's hands came up in an instinctive defensive gesture, but she was trying to defend against playground fighting techniques while facing someone who had been trained to neutralize threats with military precision. Alex's left hand captured Brooke's right wrist in a grip that utilized specific pressure points to cause immediate numbness in the entire arm, while her right hand delivered a controlled strike to the side of Brooke's neck that targeted the carotid artery and vagus nerve. The technique was designed to cause temporary loss of consciousness without permanent damage, a skill that combat medics learned for situations where they needed to quickly subdue panicked or combative patients. Brooke's legs folded beneath her as her brain temporarily lost blood flow, and she sank to the bathroom floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Her unconsciousness would last only seconds, but the demonstration of Alex's capabilities was already complete as far as the psychological impact on the remaining witness was concerned. Haley had been frozen in place since the moment Alex struck. Madison, her mind unable to process the speed and efficiency with which her two companions had been neutralized. The bubbly, confident girl who had spent months participating in the systematic harassment of someone she considered helpless was now face to face with a reality that shattered every assumption she had made about power, control, and the nature of violence. "Please," Haley whispered, pressing herself against the wall as Alex turned toward her with the same calm expression she had worn throughout weeks of abuse. "Please, I'm sorry. We didn't mean that we were just... Please don't hurt me." Alex studied Haley's terrified face for a moment, noting the genuine fear and the beginning of understanding that was dawning in the girl's eyes. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, the choice between using her training to inflict punishment on someone who had tormented her, or demonstrating the discipline and restraint that separated professional soldiers from mere thugs. "I'm not going to hurt you," Alex said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure. "But you need to understand something very clearly. I spent 18 months in Afghanistan as a combat medic. I saved lives and I took lives, and I learned skills that you can't even imagine. What just happened here was me showing restraint." She moved closer to Haley, close enough that the terrified girl could see the absolute certainty in Alex's eyes. "I could have killed both of them in the time it took me to put them down. I chose not to. That choice was based on the discipline and training that real soldiers learn, not on fear or weakness or any of the other things you've been assuming about me." Madison was beginning to recover her ability to breathe, gasping and wheezing as her diaphragm slowly resumed normal function. Brooke was stirring on the floor, her eyes fluttering as consciousness returned along with the memory of what had happened to her. Both girls were discovering that their assumptions about violence, power, and control had been fundamentally wrong in ways that would reshape their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Alex knelt down to gather her scattered belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the chaos she had just created. The military novel was retrieved with particular care, its familiar weight in her hands, serving as a reminder of the values and principles that had guided her actions even in this moment of unleashed capability. "This ends now," she said, her voice carrying to all three girls with unmistakable finality. "The harassment, the games, the systematic campaign to make my life miserable, it's over. You picked the wrong person to target, and you pushed too far." The sound of students moving through the hallways outside the bathroom served as a reminder that the world beyond this small space was continuing to function normally, unaware that the social dynamics of Lincoln High School had just been fundamentally altered by a demonstration of capabilities that none of them had imagined possible. The silence that followed Alex's demonstration of combat capability stretched across the bathroom like a physical presence, broken only by Madison's labored breathing and the distant sounds of normal school activity continuing in the hallways beyond. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across a scene that would have been impossible to predict when the morning began with its usual routines and familiar patterns. Three of Lincoln High School's most socially powerful students were now confronting a reality that shattered every assumption they had made about hierarchy, control, and the nature of real power. Madison slowly straightened from her doubled-over position, one hand pressed against her chest as her respiratory system gradually returned to normal function. The physical pain from Alex's strike was already beginning to fade, but the psychological impact of being rendered completely helpless in a matter of seconds would leave marks that lasted far longer than any bruise. Her eyes, which had always held the confident gleam of someone who had never faced genuine consequences for her actions, now showed a mixture of fear, confusion, and something approaching respect that she had never felt for another student. The realization that was dawning in Madison's mind went far beyond simple recognition that Alex was physically capable of defending herself. What truly shook Madison to her core was the understanding that she had been conducting psychological warfare against someone who possessed actual combat experience, someone for whom the teenage social conflicts that defined Madison's world were merely background noise compared to the life-and-death struggles she had survived in Afghanistan. The casual cruelty that Madison had wielded like a precision instrument suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate when measured against genuine violence and its consequences. Brooke's recovery was slower and more disorienting, as her brain struggled to process the gap between her last clear memory and her current position on the bathroom floor. The technique that Alex had used to render her unconscious was designed to minimize lasting effects while providing immediate incapacitation. But the psychological trauma of experiencing helplessness so complete and sudden was something that no amount of medical precision could mitigate. As full awareness returned, Brooke found herself looking up at Alex with an expression that mixed terror with a grudging acknowledgement that she had fundamentally misjudged her target. The sharp-tongued confidence that had made Brooke Madison's most effective lieutenant in campaigns of social destruction was nowhere to be found as she slowly sat up against the bathroom wall. Her usual arsenal of cutting remarks and psychological manipulation techniques seemed utterly inadequate when faced with someone who had just demonstrated the ability to neutralize multiple opponents with surgical precision. The girl who had spent years perfecting the art of identifying and exploiting weakness was now confronting her own vulnerability in ways that challenged her basic understanding of how power functioned in social relationships. Haley remained pressed against the wall where Alex's approach had driven her, her body language displaying the kind of submissive posture that animals adopt when confronted by apex predators. The bubbly personality that had masked her calculating intelligence was completely absent, replaced by a survival instinct that recognized genuine danger when it finally appeared. Her mind was racing through everything she knew about Alex, reinterpreting months of observed behavior through the lens of this stunning revelation about her true background and capabilities. The scattered contents of Alex's backpack took on new significance as the three girls processed what they had just witnessed. The textbooks and school supplies that they had dismissed as the possessions of an ordinary transfer student now seemed like props in an elaborate disguise that had concealed someone whose actual experiences dwarfed anything in their sheltered suburban lives. The military novel that had triggered the final confrontation was no longer just a book, but a symbol of service and sacrifice that they were only beginning to comprehend. Alex's demeanor in the aftermath of the confrontation displayed the kind of controlled professionalism that characterized military personnel who had been trained to compartmentalize violence and return immediately to normal function. There was no gloating over her victory, no theatrical display of dominance, no attempt to maximize the psychological impact of what had just occurred. She simply continued gathering her belongings with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that actions had consequences and that the situation required immediate damage control. The transformation in the bathroom's atmosphere was palpable as the established power dynamics of Lincoln High School underwent a fundamental restructuring in the span of less than 2 minutes. Madison, who had entered the confrontation as the undisputed queen of the school's social hierarchy, was now facing the reality that her influence was based on the consent of her victims rather than any inherent superiority. The systematic campaign of harassment that had seemed so sophisticated and effective now appeared childish when compared to the professional competence that Alex had just demonstrated. The immediate practical concerns that began to surface in the minds of all 4 participants centered on how this incident would be explained to school administrators, parents, and the broader student body. Madison's group had orchestrated the confrontation in a location they thought would provide privacy and control, but they now faced the challenge of explaining injuries and psychological trauma that resulted from their own aggressive actions. The plausible deniability that had protected them throughout their harassment campaign was no longer available when the evidence included physical incapacitation and clear demonstration of superior fighting skills. Alex's military training had included extensive instruction in the legal and ethical implications of using force in civilian contexts, and she was acutely aware that her actions, while justified as self-defense, would require careful explanation to authorities who lacked understanding of the specialized skills that made her response so effective. The compartmentalization techniques that allowed her to function in combat zones were now being applied to manage the transition back to civilian student status while processing the psychological impact of having used her training against teenagers. Madison's first attempt to speak came as a whisper that barely carried across the small space. "I didn't know," she said, her voice lacking any trace of the authority that had characterized her interactions with other students. "We didn't know who you really are." The admission represented more than simple acknowledgement of ignorance about Alex's background. It was recognition that the entire framework Madison had used to understand social relationships and personal power was inadequate for dealing with someone whose experiences extended far beyond the insulated world of high school politics. The psychological warfare techniques that had proven so effective against other teenagers were revealed as amateur theatrics when applied to someone who had survived actual warfare. Brooke managed to find her voice next, though it carried none of the sharp confidence that had made her such an effective participant in Madison's campaigns. "The military training, the combat experience, is that real? You actually served in Afghanistan?" The questions reflected a struggle to reconcile the quiet, seemingly vulnerable transfer student they thought they knew with the professionally competent combatant who had just neutralized them with such efficiency. The cognitive dissonance was creating a fundamental reassessment of everything they thought they understood about strength, vulnerability, and the nature of genuine toughness. Alex's response was measured and precise, delivered with the kind of calm authority that comes from having nothing left to prove. 18 months as a combat medic with the 10th Mountain Division. 2 Purple Hearts, multiple commendations for actions under fire, medical discharge due to injuries sustained in an IED attack. Everything you've been putting me through for the past month is something I survived every day for over a year in actual combat zones. The revelation hit the 3 girls with the force of a physical blow, as they finally understood the full scope of their miscalculation and the true nature of the person they had chosen to target. The news of what had happened in the 2nd floor bathroom spread through Lincoln High School with the velocity and distortion that characterized all significant teenage social events. But the details that emerged carried a weight and credibility that distinguished this incident from typical high school drama. Students who had witnessed the aftermath, Madison emerging pale and shaken, Brooke walking unsteadily with one hand against the wall for support, Haley following behind them with the wide-eyed expression of someone who had seen something that fundamentally challenged her understanding of reality, knew immediately that something extraordinary had occurred. The first whispered conversations began during 4th period, as students who had observed the trio's unusual behavior shared their observations with friends who possessed the social intelligence to recognize that the school's established power structure had somehow been disrupted. The initial rumors were wild and inconsistent. Some claimed that Alex had beaten up all 3 girls simultaneously. Others insisted that she had used weapons, or that she had somehow called in outside help to settle her grievances. The truth, when it finally emerged through more reliable sources, proved to be both more restrained and more shocking than the initial speculation. By lunch period, the story had achieved the kind of widespread circulation that transforms individual incidents into school-wide legends. But the usual process of exaggeration and embellishment was being countered by first-hand accounts from students who had encountered the participants in the immediate aftermath. These witnesses provided details that lent credibility to even the most extraordinary claims: Madison's obvious difficulty breathing, Brooke's disorientation and unsteady movement, Haley's uncharacteristic silence and withdrawn behavior, and, most significantly, Alex's complete composure and normal appearance. Despite having allegedly single-handedly defeated 3 opponents, the social dynamics that had governed Lincoln High School for years began to shift in ways that were immediately visible to anyone who understood the complex hierarchies and alliances that structured teenage relationships. Students who had previously competed for Madison's attention and approval now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, uncertain how to interpret her obvious shaken state and unwilling to commit themselves to supporting someone whose invincibility had been so dramatically challenged. The broader student population's response to Alex was even more dramatic, as the quiet transfer student who had been invisible for months suddenly became the center of attention that ranged from respectful admiration to nervous apprehension. Students who had never spoken to Alex before began nodding respectfully when they encountered her in the hallways, while others gave her a wide berth that suggested they weren't entirely certain whether she represented a threat to their own safety. Academic environment at Lincoln High was disrupted as teachers noticed unusual tension and distraction among students who were normally focused on their coursework. Several instructors reported that their classes were dominated by whispered conversations and furtive glances toward empty seats where key participants in the morning's drama were conspicuously absent. The administration's attempts to maintain normal educational activities were complicated by the obvious preoccupation of students who were more interested in processing the social earthquake that had shaken their carefully ordered world. Alex's experience of sudden notoriety was complicated by her military training and her ongoing struggles with post-traumatic stress, as the attention and speculation threatened to overwhelm the careful psychological defenses she had constructed to manage her transition to civilian life. The hypervigilance that had been a survival mechanism in Afghanistan was now activated by the constant awareness of being observed and discussed, creating a level of stress that made concentration on academic work nearly impossible. The faculty response to the incident reflected the institutional challenges that schools face when dealing with situations that fall outside standard disciplinary frameworks. Vice Principal Chen's investigation was hampered by the lack of serious injuries, the absence of clear evidence about what had actually occurred, and the reluctance of all participants to provide detailed accounts of their encounter. The official incident report would eventually classify the event as a verbal altercation with minor physical contact, language that completely failed to capture the significance of what had actually transpired. Madison's behavior in the days following the bathroom confrontation represented a complete transformation of her social persona, as the confident leadership that had defined her high school career was replaced by a cautious uncertainty that reflected her new understanding of the limits of her influence. The girl who had ruled Lincoln High through a combination of social manipulation and strategic cruelty was now forced to navigate an environment where her assumptions about power and control had been fundamentally challenged. The psychological impact on Madison extended far beyond the immediate physical effects of Alex's defensive strike, encompassing a comprehensive reassessment of her own capabilities and limitations that challenged her basic identity. The realization that she had been conducting what she considered sophisticated psychological warfare against someone with actual combat experience created a cognitive dissonance that manifested in anxiety, depression, and a loss of confidence that affected every aspect of her daily functioning. Brooke's recovery from the brief unconsciousness that Alex had induced was complicated by the psychological trauma of experiencing complete helplessness for the first time in her life. The sharp-tongued confidence that had made her such an effective participant in Madison's harassment campaigns was replaced by a wary caution that reflected her new understanding of how quickly and easily her sense of control could be stripped away by someone with superior training and experience. The broader implications of the incident extended throughout the school's social ecosystem, as students who had previously felt secure in their understanding of social hierarchies were forced to confront the possibility that their assumptions about strength, weakness, and social status were fundamentally flawed. The revelation that the quiet transfer student possessed combat training and military experience challenged basic assumptions about appearance, capability, and the nature of genuine toughness that had structured adolescent relationships for generations. Administration's handling of the incident reflected institutional priorities that focused on liability management and public relations, rather than addressing the underlying issues that had created the confrontation in the first place. The failure to recognize the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign that had preceded the bathroom encounter, combined with the inability to understand the significance of Alex's military background, resulted in responses that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while completely missing the educational opportunities that such incidents could provide. Alex's parents' reaction to learning about the incident through official school channels was complicated by their own military backgrounds and their understanding of the challenges that combat veterans face when transitioning to civilian environments. Colonel Chen's pride in his daughter's restraint and professionalism was tempered by concern about the psychological stress that the confrontation had created, and the ongoing challenges of helping Alex integrate into a social environment that was fundamentally different from military culture. That the long-term consequences of the bathroom confrontation were already becoming apparent as Lincoln High School's carefully established social order underwent a reconstruction that would permanently alter the relationships and power structures that had governed student interactions. The incident had created a new understanding of strength, capability, and the importance of treating others with respect that extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence the broader school community's approach to conflict resolution and social dynamics. In the weeks that followed the bathroom confrontation, Chen discovered that her demonstration of combat capabilities had created opportunities for positive change that extended far beyond her own personal situation at Lincoln High School. The incident had revealed not only her military background, but also her fundamental commitment to using strength in service of protection rather than domination, a distinction that began to attract the attention of students who had their own experiences with harassment and social marginalization. The first approach came from Marcus Williams, a sophomore who had been dealing with persistent bullying from a group of junior varsity football players who had targeted him because of his small stature and academic focus. Marcus had observed Alex's transformation from victim to protector with the keen interest of someone who desperately needed to believe that bullies could be stopped, and he had worked up the courage to approach her during lunch period with a hesitant request for advice about dealing with his own tormentors. Alex's response to Marcus's request demonstrated the maturity and wisdom that her military service had developed, as she focused not on teaching him fighting techniques, but on helping him understand the psychology of bullying and the importance of developing confidence through legitimate achievements rather than through intimidation of others. Her advice drew on lessons learned from military leadership training about the difference between authority based on respect and authority based on fear, concepts that proved surprisingly applicable to the social dynamics of high school life. Conversation with Marcus opened Alex's eyes to the broader impact that her actions could have on the Lincoln High School community, as she realized that her unique combination of combat training and genuine commitment to helping others positioned her to address problems that traditional authority figures had been unable to solve. The skills that had made her an effective combat medic, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess situations quickly and accurately, and to take decisive action when necessary, were equally valuable in civilian contexts where vulnerable individuals needed protection from predators. Alex's approach to mentoring other students reflected the same discipline and professionalism that had characterized her military service, as she established clear boundaries about what kind of help she was willing to provide while maintaining her commitment to using her capabilities only for defensive purposes. She made it clear that she would not teach fighting techniques to students who might use them inappropriately, but she was willing to provide guidance about conflict avoidance, de-escalation strategies, and the importance of seeking appropriate help when facing serious threats. The transformation in Alex's role at Lincoln High School from isolated victim to respected protector occurred gradually but unmistakably, as word spread through the student body that she was someone who could be trusted to intervene appropriately when conventional solutions proved inadequate. Her reputation for fairness, restraint, and genuine concern for others' welfare created a different kind of social influence than the fear-based dominance that had characterized Madison's previous reign, establishing a model of leadership that emphasized service and protection rather than control and manipulation. Madison's own journey of personal growth in the aftermath of the confrontation proved to be more complex and challenging than anyone had anticipated, as she struggled to reconstruct her identity and social relationships without the artificial superiority that had previously defined her high school experience. The process of genuine self-reflection that followed her humbling encounter with Alex revealed insecurities and emotional wounds that had been hidden beneath years of carefully constructed social performance, creating opportunities for authentic personal development that would have been impossible while she remained trapped in her role as the school's queen bee. The relationship between Alex and Madison evolved from one of antagonism and victim to something approaching mutual respect. Though the process required months of careful navigation and genuine effort on both sides, Madison's attempts to apologize for her previous behavior were initially met with polite but distant responses from Alex, who had learned through military experience that words needed to be supported by consistent actions before they could be considered meaningful indicators of changed attitudes. The broader impact of Alex's presence at Lincoln High School extended beyond individual relationships to influence the school's overall culture and approach to dealing with conflict and social problems. Teachers and administrators began to recognize that their previous methods of addressing bullying and harassment had been inadequate, and they sought Alex's input on developing more effective strategies for creating a safer and more inclusive educational environment. Alex's decision to share selected aspects of her military experience with appropriate school personnel proved to be beneficial for both her own healing process and the institution's understanding of how to better serve students who came from diverse backgrounds and experiences. Her willingness to speak to classes about military service, leadership, and the importance of using strength responsibly created educational opportunities that helped other students develop more mature perspectives on conflict resolution and personal responsibility. The legacy that Chen established during her time at Lincoln High School demonstrated that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to use one's capabilities in service of justice and protection. Her example showed that military training and combat experience, when guided by proper values and ethical principles, could be powerful tools for creating positive change in civilian communities. The quiet transfer student who had initially sought only to blend in and complete her education had instead become a catalyst for transformation that improved the school environment for countless other students who had previously felt helpless in the face of systematic harassment and social cruelty. The lessons learned from Alex's experience at Lincoln High School would continue to influence the school's culture long after her graduation. As students and faculty alike remembered the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the hidden strengths and capabilities that every individual possesses. 6 months later, Chen stood at the podium during Lincoln High's graduation ceremony, not as the valedictorian, but as the recipient of the newly created Service and Leadership Award, an honor established specifically to recognize her transformation of the school's culture. The quiet transfer student who had once eaten lunch alone now looked out at an audience that included not just her proud parents, but Marcus Williams and dozens of other students whose lives she had quietly improved through mentorship and protection. Madison Taylor sat in the third row, her own graduation cap slightly askew, watching with genuine admiration as Alex delivered a brief speech about the difference between power and strength. The former Queen Bee had spent the spring semester volunteering with Alex at a local veterans center, learning firsthand about real service and sacrifice. Their unlikely friendship had become one of Lincoln High's most remarkable transformation stories. As Alex concluded her remarks with a quote from her father about using strength to lift others up rather than tear them down, the entire graduating class rose in spontaneous applause. The girl who had knocked out 3 bullies with surgical precision had ultimately conquered something far more important. She had shown an entire school community what authentic leadership looked like. In the audience, several underclassmen were already planning how they would carry forward Alex's legacy of protecting the vulnerable and standing up to injustice with wisdom rather than just force. What did you think of Alex's incredible journey from bullied transfer student to school protector? Her story proves that real strength isn't about the ability to hurt others. It's about the wisdom to use your power to help them. If Alex's transformation inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, because everyone has a story worth telling, and some of the most powerful ones come from the most unexpected places. What would you have done in Alex's situation? Let us know in the comments below.